Well, good evening and welcome to St Alban's Church this lovely October evening. The idea for this talk first came about in late 2019 after the canonisation of John Henry Newman as a saint. We decided that it would be a very good idea to celebrate the first anniversary of that canonisation when he was made a saint of the church. So we were planning for something for October 2020, but one or two things got in the way. However, the idea revived, and here we are on the 9th of October 2022, and we are going to listen to two different but I think complementary views on John Henry Newman. Newman, who started his life as an Anglican, who ended it as a Catholic, but who really is a saint for all those who follow the way of life to which we are all as Christians called. We're very pleased to have with us Rev Dr Tom Keighley, who is the assistant priest at our sister church here at St Nicholas. He's also the Dean for Self-Supporting Ministry in this region, and he's researched quite extensively on that area, but he also has a particular love of and interest in Newman, and he'll be speaking to us from an Anglican perspective. We're also very pleased to welcome Monsignor Roderick Strange. Now, Father Rod has been researching and working on Newman for, I think you said, almost 60 years. I didn't realise that you could actually get books for 3-year-olds on... but there we are. And has written extensively and is one of our country's, he's quite shy about this, one of our country's experts on John Henry Newman. He is also the rector of the Mater Ecclesiae College, Pontifical Institute, which is based at St Mary's University at Twickenham, which is involved in the study of theology, and a number of students from seminaries will attend there as well. And they award degrees that are awarded by Rome, by the Vatican. And he has many other things that he would rather I didn't talk about, all good. We are also, for those who are listening remotely through the internet, you will already know, but perhaps not everyone here knows, that this is being recorded for the What Good News website. And the website name is whatgoodnews.org. And you'll be able to hear this recording sometime later on. So without further ado, I will hand over now to Father Tom. Thank you.
Well, I was saying earlier I was delighted that we had a real expert here, so that all my mistakes can be corrected later. I want to start with a prayer, which I think you'll know, written by Cardinal Newman. Lead kindly light amid the encircling gloom. Lead thou me on. The night is dark and I am far from home. Lead thou me on. Keep thou my feet. I do not ask to see the distant scene. One step enough for me. I was not ever thus, nor prayed that thou shouldst lead me on. I love to choose and see my path, but now lead thou me on. I loved the garish day, and spite of fears, pride ruled my will. Remember not past years, so long thy power hath blessed me. Sure it still will lead me on. O'er moor and fen, o'er crag and torrent, till the night is done, and with the morn those angels' faces smile, which I have loved long since and lost a while. Lead kindly light. I was talking about Newman at our Thursday communion a couple of weeks ago, and saying that my real love of Newman started when, as a member of a boys' choir, we were invited to sing at the Kendal Festival, and what we were asked to sing was to join with other choirs and sing Gerontius, which a number of the tunes and words from that we all use as hymns. It was a great piece to sing when you were a sort of pseudo bass baritone shortly after my voice had broken. Over one summer holiday, I went from being treble to being bass. So no difficulties there. But I come at Newman from research I did about a decade ago when I was a fellow of the Nightingale Foundation. And I was invited to do some studies through them and with their financial support on the spirituality of Florence Nightingale, which you may or may not know is a vastly complex issue, not least because, like Newman, Nightingale was a polymath, speaking several languages, being at that time Europe's leading statistician, and of course going on, not just to the Crimea, but for the next 50 years, as a major influence on social policy, as indeed, in his own way, was Newman. So I come at it from the point of view of a number of rather complex Victorians. Elizabeth Fry was pushed into my life when I started psychiatric nurse training, because, of course, she was responsible for the major reforms of mental health treatment in the early 19th century. And then a little later, Josephine Butler appeared as the great reformer around the issues concerning prostitutes. And very interestingly, even though Nightingale and Butler fell out about how to resolve this problem, which was an immense problem in London at the time, when Butler's health gave in and she eventually had to retire with her husband up to Almouth, Nightingale, every month for the rest of her life, wrote her a letter and sent her a box of fruit and other things to strengthen her, usually including a bottle of port. So let me just give you some short background about Newman. Born in 1801 into a Church of England family in the City of London, one of 5 saints to come from the City of London, and if anybody wants, if they get bored during this session, wants to make a list of them all, then I'm sure Father Joe will be able to correct us. He was educated at Great Ealing School, where there were a number of eminent teachers. And in his last year there, he had, for want of a better term, an evangelical conversion, and in his own words, became a Calvinist. Well, Calvinism is quite an extreme form of the Protestant tradition, one that holds to certainties, and to use a Latin phrase, believes that the only thing that really matters is sola scriptura, the scriptures, which isn't the general belief of the Church of England, and of course is not the general belief of the Roman Catholic tradition either. From there, he eventually went to Trinity College, Oxford, where after 3 years of intensive study, he broke down in his exams. Well, we've all done that, haven't we? And therefore was awarded a degree below the line, as they say, and had to apply for a fellowship at Oriel, which was actually to his enormous benefit, because Oriel was really the seedbed of a great deal of intellectual debate and discussion. And it was there that he began to meet some of the people who would influence him most in later years. Shortly after that, he was ordained deacon at Christ Church Cathedral in Oxford, and some 6 months later ordained priest. Eventually, he was appointed to the University Church of St Mary, and there provided a home for what we know as the Oxford movement. And the Oxford movement was about trying to get the Church of England to rediscover its Catholic roots. From an Anglican perspective, there were two major things going on in the early 19th century. One was the evangelical reform, emerging out of Camden, and very well known today, but not because of that, because that was the home of the political work to get slavery abolished. And the second movement was the Oxford movement, which was much more concerned about the theological relationship between the then Church of England and its Catholic antecedents. His church became the home for much of that discussion, public sermons, and it's often suggested that a sermon by Keble on the 14th of July 1833, a week after Newman came back from travelling in the southern European continent, was the start of the Oxford movement. Newman drove it forward with what was called tracts, which rather like thought pieces that you might find in one of the broadsheet papers. These were analytical pieces, pointing out what the Church of England had forgotten about its history. Newman wrote a number of them, but he brought things to a head in the 90th of these tracts, in which he took apart the 39 articles that the Church of England rests on, pointing out that none of them were written in any way to condemn the Catholic Church. Now, his colleagues were a bit miffed about that. And indeed, the then Bishop of Oxford got involved and banned the writing of any more such tracts. In part, it led to Newman losing his licence and having to move on to a place called Littlemore, which was one of the smaller churches in the parish in the south of Oxford. And there, living with a group of like-minded people in a semi-monastic manner. He stayed there for a couple of years before then being received into the Catholic Church. And Father Joe has brought along this icon showing Cardinal Newman with the person who received him into the Catholic Church. Now, this is where my interest in Newman becomes a little more direct, because it was after he'd been received into the Catholic Church and the publication subsequently of a biography called Apologia Pro Vita Sua, that Nightingale had sent by her sister to her when she was working in Germany. And for Nightingale, it was one of the stimuli that she received from people in the Catholic Church, Newman and Manning in particular, to think more deeply about what she was concerned about in her own spiritual life. Nightingale had mystical experiences. When she was quite young, as a teen, she'd heard directly the word of God, telling her that she was to take up concern for the poor and the ill. And being a rather sensitive girl, that upset her a little. And the tree under which this happened has been preserved. And if you're feeling in need of particular closeness to God, you can go there and sit and pray and hope that you too have some sort of message. Years later, when she had taken herself with two friends to visit both Egypt and Greece, she again began to hear the word of God directly, and her diary for her visit in Greece is almost as if God was tapping her on the shoulder and saying, you will do this, you will do that. And future writers who've looked at this describe it as a sort of Joan of Arc experience, because it separated her from her family, it separated her from all her social contacts, and it thrust her into a debate with people who were knowledgeable about these experiences. And so her discussions with people like Newman began. She visited him in Rome, and in her diary commented on the quality of the accommodation he had, ever the practical person. And then debated with her family whether Newman was right, because Nightingale's concern was that we should be studying the laws of God. And by that, she didn't mean the commandments, or indeed the Beatitudes, though she did think that the Beatitudes were pretty close to being the laws of God, but rather that it was our failing as human beings to understand that God had established the world in a way that had laws. Now, people who study physics today would understand that and follow with it. But her approach was way out of line. And it was only because she was in these discussions with eminent people like this that she was able to keep going. In the Oxford movement, as it began to take root in the Church of England, Nightingale saw it as a remarkable benefit for the poor, and comments in one of her letters about the marvellous churches that the priests involved in this movement created, the lovely smells they created for a population that was unwashed, the safe environment for women who were abused. To bring it back home, the private chapel that Newman created for himself was called the Chapel of St Nicholas and St Mary. And so for those of us who have long wondered why our church was named St Nicholas, it was because the priests who created the mission church there in the 1930s, and indeed moved it, in particular the priest who moved it into its current building, would have seen themselves as part of a latter-day Oxford movement. Given that Newman was in touch with many other people as well, and supporting them on their spiritual journeys, this perhaps begins to explain why one can see Newman as a saint for all Christians. Indeed, he is seen as pointing to God and is the patron of adult faith formation, sometimes described as seekers, those who are trying to discover their own paths, but also how that relates to what God wants for them. That's why Newman speaks to those of us of all traditions. One can see from his life that he was on a journey. Church of England, Calvinism, Catholicism. Nightingale pointed out at one point that he was the first person she had read who was concerned about the early fathers. And with typical Nightingale prescience, said all these men in the desert could not have survived without some women. So where are the early mothers? Which, of course, some scholars have taken to heart and now study. But that's as far as I want to go. Like you, I want to hear a real expert on the subject. Thank you.
Tom, thank you. Thank you very much. Excuse my voice. I've had a bit of a cough and cold this week, and it's a bit of a croak, I'm afraid. But realizing, as I mentioned to Ken earlier, that this is not a penitential season, I did not sing during Mass this morning, because I didn't think I should I should inflict that upon the people who had come to Mass. But Tom, thank you for that. Thank you all for being here. And Ken, thank you for this invitation. Funny to think, isn't it, that 3 weeks ago, tomorrow, if we weren't out in the street, I imagine we were all, or many of us, perhaps all of us, glued to our television sets, watching the funeral of Her Majesty the Queen. I don't know about you, but one of the things that struck me in particular about the occasion was the way in which it seemed to me the grandeur of the ceremonial that was focused upon Westminster Abbey enabled a kind of control of emotion. I mean, it was so magnificent, you know, that people, unlike, shall we say, to use the obvious comparison, the death of Princess Diana 25 or so years ago, unlike that occasion where there was that extraordinary outpouring of emotion, there was a sort of control that the grandeur and the splendor of the ceremonial made possible. And then it struck me, by contrast, in the evening, late afternoon evening, when we came to Windsor, the mood was different. There was, for all the ceremonial and grandeur, there was a warmth and an intimacy about what was taking place that I think many people found, certainly I did, very moving. And amongst the prayers that were said on that occasion, we heard this: O Lord, support us all the day long of this troublous life, until the shades lengthen and the evening comes. The busy world is hushed, the fever of life is over, and our work is done. Then, Lord, in thy mercy, grant us safe lodging, a holy rest, and peace at the last. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. And I imagine that prayer is familiar to many of us, again, if not all of us, and it's familiar as a prayer of Newman's. Is it? Where might you find it? Where is it a prayer of Newman's? It isn't a prayer that Newman ever composed. It is a very slightly edited version of the final sentences of his sermon, Wisdom and Innocence, one of his sermons in the volume of Sermons on Subjects of the Day. And what I find ironical and fascinating is that when in 1864 Newman was in a sort of rather dismissive way referred to by Charles Kingsley, where Kingsley said in a review of a book that he was reviewing, truth for its own sake had never been a virtue with the Roman clergy. Father Newman informs us that it need not, and on the whole ought not to be. That was Kingsley's remark that provoked Newman's response and led, before too long, to his writing that autobiography to which Tom referred, the Apologia Pro Vita Sua. And in the controversy, before Newman decided that he had to write, when Kingsley was bringing out, as he thought, evidence for what he had said about Newman, it was that very sermon, Wisdom and Innocence, to which he referred. That was part of the evidence that he used. So we can, at least I smiled at the irony that that this, in fact, as it is, very beautiful prayer arranged, but these words, their origin, comes from a sermon which is involved in that controversy, that very important controversy, to which I'll return, between Newman and Kingsley. There are some other words of Newman's with which you may well be familiar. They appeared in a little volume called Meditations and Devotions, which was brought out by William Neville, who had been the Cardinal's chaplain in the later years of his life. And it was published in 1893, 3 years after Newman died. But these words were actually written in the March of 1848, so about 2.5 years after he had left the Church of England to join the Church of Rome. And you may well be familiar with this. It's, again, you often see it on prayer cards. God has created me to do him some definite service. And then a little later he goes on, if I am in sickness, my sickness may serve him. In perplexity, my perplexity may serve him. If I am in sorrow, my sorrow may serve him. And it's occurred to me just in recent years that those words with which so many people who have an interest in Newman are familiar, that those words give us a kind of snapshot of Newman's life. As Tom has already indicated, to some extent, in Newman's very early life, the time of his evangelical conversion, the time when he moved from, insofar as he might have been thought at one stage to be a bit of a liberal rationalist, and then as he braced himself for what became the Oxford movement, those 3 occasions in 1816, 1827, and then in 1833 were occasions of illness, or illness was involved in those. He saw those illnesses later as providential. If I am in sickness, my sickness may serve him. After the illness in 1833, when he returned, and as Tom said, about a week later, Keble preached, John Keble, Newman's great friend, preached at his assize sermon, which Newman regarded the 14th of July, 1833, as the start of the Oxford movement. We were talking about history earlier, Ken. We all know with history, nothing is quite as simple as that. You don't have, when did the French Revolution start? On Bastille Day in 1789? No, it's not quite that simple. But Newman said the Oxford movement began on the 14th of July, 1833. And that's the date that people use. But it's not quite as straightforward as that. However, it was from that time, for the next 6 years of Newman's life, between 1833 and 1839, where he was, you could say, in his pomp as an Anglican. And to a degree that took him by surprise, this movement, Tractarian movement, to restore a sense of the Catholic tradition within the Church of England, took off to a degree that he had never imagined or expected. And he, along with John Keble, Edward Pusey, and others, was a significant leader of this movement. And then what happened? 1839, he suddenly, I'm not going to go into this, but it was then that he began to wonder about his position in the Church of England. Had he actually got it right? So for the next 6 years, didn't rush 1839 to 1845, wondering, should I really be, if I want to save my soul, thinking of that old phrase, outside the church there is no salvation. Where is the true church? Is it to be found, I'm oversimplifying, of course, but is it to be found in the Church of England? Or should I, if I have actually seen it to be elsewhere, if the fullness of the Church of Christ is to be found elsewhere, if you don't see that, you remain an Anglican. But if you do see it elsewhere, if it actually is going to be in the Church of Rome, ought I then to become a Roman Catholic? So he had 6 years of struggling with that. If I am in perplexity, my perplexity may serve him. By 1845, he decided, yes, that he really needed to move to the Church of Rome. And in the Apologia, he spoke of that movement to the Church of Rome as like coming into port after a rough sea. But it wasn't as simple as that, because in Newman's Catholic years, for many of his Catholic years, there were real challenges facing him. If I am in sorrow, my sorrow may serve him. So just wanting to say really something to you about Newman as a Catholic. It was a time of much sorrow for him. Not so much sorrow about his faith, but about his experiences of life. There is in his journal, in the January of 1863, he wrote, "Oh, how forlorn and dreary has been my course since I have been a Catholic. Here has been the contrast. As a Protestant, I felt my religion dreary, but not my life. But as a Catholic, my life dreary, not my religion." And it's so easy to understand that. As an Anglican, he had felt critical of the Church of England as he found it. And that's why he was so involved in the Oxford movement, to reform it, to restore to the great breadth of the Church of England its Catholic tradition. That's what he was trying to do, but it was a real struggle, and he was constantly being slapped down by those in authority, the very people whose position as authoritative he was trying to build up. So religion was dreary, but not life. He was there in Oxford. He loved Oxford. He was amongst his friends. He was having a wonderful time. It was delightful. When he became a Catholic, he felt at home, at peace in that faith, that tradition of the faith that he had embraced. But life was hard, with people and with projects. He had difficult people to cope with. Nicholas Wiseman, who had been a great help to him in the earlier days, and in his early days as a Catholic to some degree, although Newman could be critical of him. Wiseman, who became the first Archbishop of Westminster when the Catholic hierarchy was restored in 1850. But Wiseman, you could say, I mean, he was not always very well. There are all sorts of incidents where he just did not give Newman the support that he could have and should have. When Wiseman died, perhaps this is the simplest way of summing it up, when Wiseman died in 1865, one of the things that Newman said in a letter to his friend, Charles Russell, in Ireland, personally, he said, I have not much to thank Wiseman for since I was a Catholic. He always meant kindly, but his impulses, kind as they were evanescent, and he was naturally influenced by those who got round him and occupied his ear. Wiseman was constantly letting Newman down. Then there was Father Faber, Frederick Faber, well known as a hymn writer, very popular in London society, quite a character. But Newman felt that Faber was constantly manipulating him and trying to take advantage of their relationship. Faber, who became a Catholic before Newman, but then when Newman came back to England to found the oratory, which was one of the good things Wiseman did for Newman, to encourage him to adapt the oratorian way of life, the oratory founded by St Philip Neri, to adapt the oratorian way of life for England. But Faber then wanted to become an oratorian, brought a whole group of other people to become oratorians with him, and then Newman founded a second oratory in London. Faber became superior there and then tried to rearrange their constitution, which Newman had written and had been established by Rome. In 1856, Faber died in 1863, but in 1856, Newman wrote to his friend Ambrose St John, as to Father Faber himself, he now finds himself as he was before he sought the oratory, independent, with all the additional advantages which Philip Neri, the founder of the Oratorians, with which St. Philip extended reputation and years give him. Newman at this time was in Ireland. We're going to come back to this, founding the university there. There's a letter that Newman wrote, I think again to Ambrose, where he says, don't send me Faber's letters, they will only make me angry. He sounds angry enough as it is, you know. And then in Ireland, he had gone there at the invitation of Paul Cullen, who had been the Archbishop of Armagh, but became the Archbishop of Dublin, and eventually a Cardinal. Other things one could say about Cullen. But Cullen, Newman would write to him for answers to questions about how he wished the Dublin University. Cullen had invited Newman to found the Dublin University. How to deal with various matters. You just not receive an answer. And then Cullen would make decisions which were contrary to what Newman had advised him. So it was a very difficult relationship. And there is, a year or so before Newman left Dublin, he was there from 80, travelling across the sea very often, but between 1851 and 1858. This is in April 56. One of the things that he did was to build a very beautiful church. It's the first church, quite by chance, not my plan at all. The first time I ever said a mass in Ireland was actually in Newman's church on St Stephen's Green, and it's a very beautiful church. Newman had written to Cullen about it, and Cullen then wrote back eventually with a whole series of questions, who would have the lease of the church if Newman left? Who was going to be preaching there? Who were going to be the clergy organising? He was about to come and consecrate the church, and suddenly he sends Newman all these questions. Newman wrote to a friend to say, I'm very glad... Newman wrote to Cullen, rather, to say, you can tell how irritated he was. I am very glad to have elicited your Grace's questions. I should have been still more grateful to have elicited them some time ago, but your Grace is the judge whether they could have been asked at an earlier date. You could tell how fed up he was. And he said to another friend of his a couple of years later, he said, Cullen treated me from the first like a scrub. Somebody, just a servant, not somebody to be concerned with. And then, of course, there was Manning. People contrast Newman and Manning, and they were very different personalities. They had been very friendly. You wouldn't say close friends, but very friendly for a very long time, for at least 30 years. The moving letters from Manning. Manning, as you may or may not know, Manning, as an Anglican priest, had been married, and his wife Caroline died, and it was a terrible experience for him. He loved her dearly, and he prayed on her. He used her prayer book for his prayers every day for the rest of his life, shocking some of his Catholic friends that he should have used his wife's prayer book. And one of the saddest things is that when he left to prepare for Roman Catholic priesthood in Rome, he took with him her letters, which was stolen in Paris, which I think is one of the most painful things that could have happened. But Newman and Manning clashed on three particular subjects. It was the time by 1860, Italy, apart from the Papal States at that stage, had become a unified country. Manning was a fierce supporter of the papal temporal power. Newman was indifferent. Yes, if the region of the Papal States gives the Pope that power, gives him the freedom, the autonomy to act, okay, that's fine. But he probably doesn't need it. After all, many bishops in the past have had temporal power and have since lost it, and their episcopacy has flourished as a consequence. If the Pope loses his temporal power, will it really matter? It's a big clash. Manning was an extremist in his interpretation of what papal infallibility would involve. Newman was apprehensive about all that and was a minimalist. And it was, of course, Newman's view that, in point of fact, prevailed. And Manning was against mixed education, which was not men and women being educated together, but Catholics and those who were not Catholics being educated together. Those were the three issues on which they clashed and why they lost trust in one another. But, because there is a but, I think, when one of the things that Manning is best known for, of course, was the way he intervened in and negotiated a settlement of the dockers' strike in the 1880s. And he wrote to Newman after receiving a letter from Newman, who wrote to congratulate him on what he had done, to say to Newman, receiving your letter this morning was one of the, I'm not quoting exactly, but one of the happiest things that I have received. So it wasn't all harshness, but there was a lack of trust. And when trust breaks down in a relationship, it's very difficult to restore it. But he was, as I say, also enormously grateful for Newman's support when his wife had died. That's what I was going to mention all those years ago. So difficult people, but also projects. The Catholic Church, the little Catholic Church in 1845, had no idea what it could do with this extraordinarily gifted man who had joined it. What they did, in fact, over the next 20 years or so in particular, was invite him to undertake particular projects, to found that Catholic University in Dublin. In 1857, while he was still in Dublin, Wiseman wrote, it was one of the occasions when Wiseman let Newman down. Wiseman wrote asking Newman to oversee a new translation of the Bible. And then, well, this was also going to be done in alliance with the Americans. Newman spent quite a lot of money getting everything prepared for this new translation, and then heard nothing more about it. So the whole project collapsed. Perhaps we can be grateful that we don't have a Newman translation of the Bible, but nevertheless, I mean, it was an example of being invited to undertake a project, taking the steps to fulfill it, and then just being left isolated. He had good correspondence with American bishops about it, who were writing and said, "What's happening? What's happening?" He said, "I know nothing." After he had come back from Dublin in 1858, in 1859, he was asked to take on the editorship of a distinguished but controversial periodical, The Rambler, which the bishops were likely to censor. Then Newman was invited to become the new editor, which was a way of forestalling the bishops' criticism. He reluctantly took on the editorship and then wanted to make clear that nevertheless a particular point of controversy had been the importance of consulting the church and the laity at large when major decisions were being taken. So he wrote what has become an important essay on that, which was published in The Rambler, and that caused a stir, and his bishop then advised him to resign the editorship, which he hadn't wanted to take it in the first place, but he only edited two editions, 2 numbers. Rome asked him to explain passages from that article, which he did, sent his explanations to Wiseman. Wiseman didn't pass them on. Rome presumed that Newman just wasn't interested in responding to their questions, to their difficulties. Only when by chance Ambrose St John, his friend, was in Rome, connected with other issues, in 1866, did he show the Cardinal in Rome what Newman had written. The Cardinal said, "This is exactly what we were looking for." And so the matter was finally closed. But he had lived under that cloud for all that time. And then during the 1860s, by which time it had become possible, according to the statutes of Oxford University, for Catholics to become undergraduates. In Cambridge, you could become an undergraduate, and you only had to take the Test Act before you graduated. So you could study for your degree at Cambridge. In Oxford, you had to take the Test Act when you matriculated at the beginning. So there were, in general terms, there were not Catholics going to Oxford. When it became possible that they might, Bishop Ullathorne, Newman's bishop, suggested that he found an oratory, open another oratory, a third Birmingham, Faber in London, but found another one in Oxford, which would in effect, this is too detailed to go into, but in effect have been a kind of Catholic chaplaincy for the Oxford undergraduates. But it was resisted by various people, resisted by Rome, and though Ullathorne encouraged Newman to do this twice, but in fact the project collapsed. So, as I say, these constant projects which he was invited to undertake and which were not, and he was not given the resources to bring these projects to a successful conclusion. Now then, particularly for us this evening, this is important. In 1863, Newman went on holiday abroad for the first time, as a holiday abroad for the first time for a very long time. He'd had to go abroad sometimes, but very rarely. When he arrived back in the August of 1863, amongst the post waiting for him was a letter from John Keble, his great friend, from whom he had not heard for 17 years. It wasn't Keble's fault. I mean, as sometimes happens, the correspondence just faltered. Keble had written to him, Newman hadn't replied because other things were going on, and it sort of filtered out. But he suddenly got this letter from Keble saying, in effect, I realize you were acting for conscience sake and we should have given you more support. So it was the resumption of a wonderful friendship. And at that time, others of Newman's friends from his Anglican days were also making contact again. Frederick Rogers, Richard Church. Pusey, incidentally, had always maintained contact with Newman. It's fascinating. There's a gap in the letters. There's a gap in Newman's correspondence of about 8 years, 46 to 54, where there are no letters between Newman and Pusey, except that when you find that first letter in 54, it's plainly not a new correspondence or a renewal of a correspondence. I'm so glad to hear from you. I'm so pleased to be writing to you again. We're in touch. Nothing like that. It's plain that plainly has been Newman destroyed. Newman, we've got 32 volumes of Newman's correspondence. It's huge. But he also destroyed vast numbers of letters. So plainly there was correspondence taking place, and his correspondence with Pusey continued all the time. But there were people who cut off. It was a difficult time. And so these people like Keble, like Frederick Rogers, like Richard Church, the future Dean of St Paul's, they were great supporters of Newman. These friendships were renewed, which was wonderful. Then later that year, and actually just 1863 into 1864, was when the controversy with Kingsley blew up, and there was, and Newman got down to, as his honesty had been impugned, he felt the only way I can answer this is not by going question by question but actually trying to give an account of my mind, of why I behaved as I did. And so as he was writing, it came out weekly, the Apologia came out weekly and was published. So it was under great pressure. And he would write, when he finished a section, he would send it off to some of these Anglican friends, like Rogers, like Church, like Keble, to say, am I remembering this correctly? Am I telling this story accurately? And invariably the answers were, yes, you are, that's it. So there was this wonderful sort of renewal of relationships between Newman and his Anglican. Even Hawkins, who had been Provost of Oriel and with whom Newman clashed over what was the better way of teaching undergraduates. This is in the late 1820s, the early 1830s. Newman Clash Hawkins lived forever, almost. He was one of the creaking gait, but he wasn't going to die soon. But Hawkins, when Newman wrote the Apologia, wrote to him, and they corresponded from time to time afterwards, wrote to say, you know, how wonderful it was to read the warmth of affection that Newman had for his Anglican friends. So there was a real renewal of relationships at that time, which was wonderful. There were other controversies as a Catholic in which Newman was involved. A controversy with Pusey. Keble was anxious that his controversy with Pusey would cause a rupture in that friendship. Not at all. It was a very amicable sort of controversy. Newman was disappointed in something that Pusey had written as a consequence of a clash Pusey was having with Manning. And Newman thought he hadn't handled it well and was critical of him for that. But they were writing each other letters, you know, and then there was to be a French version of Pusey's book, the Irenicon. And Newman said, no, just hold on a minute. Let's see what Manning says next, because then you'll be able to answer those issues which he raises. So they were very amicable disputants. And then 8 years later, in 1874, when Gladstone had attacked the decree on papal infallibility, and Newman wrote something in reply to him. And again, Gladstone was somebody whom Newman knew, would have breakfast with him sometimes, certainly once, if not, you know, occasionally. But there's good correspondence between Newman and Gladstone. And Gladstone wrote to Newman to say, you know, you've been much kinder to me in this controversy than I deserve. I'm not quoting exactly, but that really was what he was saying. So Newman's an Anglican, and Newman is a Catholic. If I am in sorrow, there was a lot of sorrow. Not everything was sorrow. Don't let me give you the wrong impression. But there was a lot of sorrow. There were a lot of struggles, hard things in those Catholic years. Except, as we know, that in the late 1870s, extraordinarily, unexpectedly, surprisingly, the new Pope Leo XIII chose to make Newman a cardinal, and that changed the scenario. And as Newman said, the cloud that had been over him for so long, that he wasn't a proper Catholic, that he wasn't genuine in his conversion, that dark cloud was lifted from him. When he went to London for the last time, which was in the March of 1886, from the 26th to the 28th of March, he went for the funeral of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. Where did he stay? He stayed with Richard Church. Didn't stay with Manning, perhaps not surprisingly, but he stayed with Richard Church, his old friend, who was Dean of St Paul's, they he visited there on other occasions as well. There's a line I love. Newman sent Church a letter and said, "I'm coming to London tomorrow." He says, "The omnipotent word of the dentist must be obeyed." So he had a dental appointment. Said, "I'll be with you for lunch and then I'll come back to Birmingham," something like that. But these friendships, which were so important, these Anglican friendships. I've gone on far too long. Tom, you're good to give me extra time. Can I just end with one final sentence, which is, again, from an Anglican sermon, but which, to my mind, sums up so much of Newman, really, but actually says something very powerful about the experience of the Christian life. The planting of Christ's cross in the heart is sharp and trying, but the stately tree rears itself aloft and has fair branches and rich fruit and is good to look upon. Thank you very much.